so nice to see you. Thank you so much for joining us for Sustainability Awareness Week here at FIT.
Thank you, Anne. I'm so delighted to be here in conversation with you.
Yes. Yeah, we're going to be taking a deep dive into legislation, pushing the fashion industry forward. Can you tell us a little bit about you and the work that you're doing at ReMake?
Yeah, so, in terms of my work, I have fought some 20 years for social justice in the fashion industry. I am Pakistani American. My family used to run garment factories back in Pakistan. And so I really come with this from a heritage standpoint. It's my part of the world where a lot of clothes are made and wanting to ensure that those women live a life of dignity and have living wages. I started my career at Business for Social Responsibility, a large consulting shop where making the business case for the likes of Gucci and Gap and Levi's and really embedding human rights and environmental practices in their supply chain. And honestly, while we made progress, I didn't feel like we made progress fast enough. And one of the things I walked away from that, working on the inside of the industry, this sentiment of, well, what if there isn't a business case for human rights? And what if this is just the right thing to do, even if markets don't reward you as such? And so I then went on to work with the United Nations for a program called Better Work, where we brought governments, brands, and unions to the table to address working conditions. So things like forced labor in Jordan, addressing gender violence in Cambodia. And there too, I sort of walked away with realizing that putting everyone at an equal seat when the power dynamics are not the same meant that workers often lost. And when Rana Plaza fell down, which was the biggest industrial disaster of our lifetime, I just thought we needed change sooner, faster. And so I left to found ReMake. And at ReMake, our mission is to fight for pay equity and climate justice in fashion. I really think putting living wages and the climate agenda front and center is the fastest way to achieve sustainability. And we do that in ReMake really in two ways. The first is a lot of education, so conversations like this. We got our run starting in fashion schools, but now we teach at schools up and down the country and even globally. But beyond that education, we run campaigns to hold the industry accountable, and we push for effective legislation, which is what I know we're going to talk about today.
Thank you so much. So interesting to hear your background. I really appreciated you talking about the business case. And I was like, oh, I wonder where she's going to go with that. And then we also say things are the right thing to do. Can you speak a little bit about the current state of the fashion industry now regarding ethical business practices and any significant changes since COVID? I know you started the hashtag Payout movement. Maybe you can speak about that a little bit as well.
Yeah, I think in COVID, it really sharpened a lot of the issues that we were worried about in the fashion industry to start with, right? So, to give you a little bit of context, one of the things that I often think about is just the volume of overproduction, right? According to McKinsey, we are making 100 billion units of clothes around the world on an annual basis. And the industry is growing by 3% a year. So, what that means is any of the sustainability efforts that the industry is putting out there are being outstripped by the volume of overproduction. The other thing we know is that clothing is the fastest growing category of waste to landfill. The average American throws away something like 75 pounds of textile and clothing a year. And we also know that most clothes today are made of fossil fuels and plastic, which means that they're going to be sitting in landfills and that we're making them so cheap and throwing them away so fast. And really, this puts fashion up there from a climate standpoint. The most conservative estimates put fashion at 4% of all carbon emissions. And to put that number in context, that means fashion emits more carbon than the entire economies of France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. So, we started even pre-COVID with this. We're producing a lot, we're throwing it away very fast, and we're making it for very little money. And then there's the human rights side of things, right? Where this $3 trillion industry, most of its workforce, the garment workers who are fashion's most essential workers, don't make a living wage, which means she is deciding, two meals or one, and not able to live a life of dignity. And so what happened in COVID is a lot of us were home. not buying very much, stores closed down. And so in March of 2020, the fashion industry made this catastrophic decision to essentially cancel all orders or demand retroactive discounts because they panicked. They panicked with, if no one's to buy anything, how can we push this economic pain onto factories who in turn were going to push it onto workers? And so what that meant was millions of workers around the world for work that they had already done were not going to get paid. And so we, in solidarity with our coalition of labor organizers, union partners, researchers, unlocked the Payout Campaign, which in the pandemic, who knew this was going to go viral? And all of that, and then that campaign unlocked $22 billion from 25 brands, from CNA to Gap, essentially to say, we're not going to stop campaigning till you reinstate those contracts. So we knew factories would get paid and workers would get paid. And really, it wasn't just us, it was so much solidarity. Amber Valletta, who I know is an FIT sustainability ambassador, used her platform for good. We had actress Nat Kelly, we had model Cameron Russell, but really it was students at FIT, students all over the world who took to Instagram, who took to TikTok, who wrote to their favorite brands to say, this is not something to do in a pandemic, to leave fashion's most essential workers without their salaries. And so even though we paint this very difficult picture of the fashion's overconsumption problem, I do think there's hope. Hope because we managed in a very difficult time during a global pandemic to launch such an effective campaign.
Yes, it really does show we can make a difference, right? I always telling students we vote every day with our wallets, and we really do. But that's really it's so impactful. Hearing those numbers is astounding. In order to make real change happen, though, Ayesha, we need companies to work hard at making serious changes to how we've been doing business for decades. We also realize that laws and regulations need to be put in place so there's no going back to where we've been. Why is it so important for governments to get involved at this point in time?
Look, let's just look at the facts, right? We have had 30 years of voluntary efforts by brands and retailers. And what I mean, once we outsourced production in the early 1990s, companies had codes of conduct. They said, we're going to continue to grow and be profitable, but assure that there is environmental sustainability and human rights. We're going to take care of all of this. And essentially, we built this private sustainability complex, as I like to think of it. Money going into private auditors who sort of do drive-by into factories. And 30 years later, we still find ourselves with just not having made significant progress. And I really think it's a lot to ask of companies, particularly publicly traded companies, when what the market is going to reward you for, what your shareholders is going to reward you for, is essentially growing at all cost and shaving down the cost of production. That's just how the industry works. And so when we look at the climate impacts or human rights impacts of fashion, this is a piece of the industry that has largely been deregulated. And given what we've seen in COVID, it has been really exciting to see policymakers, governments finally come to the table and realize that this industry needs more regulation. We can't just keep making the business case for companies to address this on their own.
Yes, I was just reading yesterday about the new bill that was passed here in the United States about climate and how much we don't even know. They said, I think we're going to see the climate industry really propel and do more in the next 4 years than we've seen in the last 40 years. So governments stepping in to do things like that can really help. Can you tell us about some of the legislation that you and ReMake have worked on introducing and passing, and what else is in the pipeline? And why do you think these regulations are so important to help put the fashion industry on the right track?
When it comes to regulation, not all regulation is the same, right? And not all regulation is a good thing. And so for us at ReMake, what's most important when we decide to put the power of our community behind supporting a bill or piece of regulation is really to see where it comes from. Our customer is garment workers. And so if something is worker-led, if it's worker-led legislation, that's when we come out to support it, because she knows best. She knows best what the conditions are like and what she needs in terms of solutions. And so earlier this year, really, this was a worker championed piece of regulation that so much industry, civil society, ReMake was involved in, is that we brought SB 62, that Senate Bill 62, the Garment Worker Protection Act, into law here in the state of California. And that bill is a really important piece of regulation because most production has fled overseas. The largest garment worker population that remains in the US is in downtown LA. Some 45,000 predominantly Latinx community of garment workers who were making somewhere between $3 and $5 working piece rate. And what this historical bill does is now abolishes piece rate, so workers make $14, not the $3, $5 that they were making. And it really holds brands and retailers jointly liable for wage theft. And that is really important because it really is the prices that brands set that leads to so much wage theft all across our industry. And what was so exciting about this bill is that we really saw our community galvanized, writing postcards and making phone calls. But really, as I said, it was garment worker led. And it was really exciting to see a lot of sustainable brands also come to support the bill. So I'm hoping that what we won in California is the way to go. And we see a lot more of this type of legislation that really gets to the crux of the matter, which is how do we get more money in the hands of garment workers? And we push something like that federally and globally.
I appreciate that you said worker-led legislation, but also people don't even feel like they have a voice, right? That they can't even begin to speak up. So, having these in place and starting this, movement and all that you've done really helps people know that their voices is equal, as you said earlier, that they have an equal voice at the table. Can you?
100%. So many times, and in classrooms, students will say, well, I try and be a really good consumer. And one of the things we try to teach is, look, you're a citizen first and a consumer second. And don't forget the power of your voice and how when individual voices come together as a collective, how powerful that can be. Many of the students in our community, beyond maybe voting for a federal election, had never called their legislators in the way that they galvanized for the Garment Worker Protection Act. So I think flexing some of that advocacy muscle is going to take us a long way.
Absolutely. What about the Fabric Act and what ReMake is doing to help support that?
Yeah, so earlier this year, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand introduced a very exciting piece of legislation called the Fabric Act, which essentially takes the good practices that we've now established in the state of California to create a federal level bill. And what's wonderful about this bill is, well, again, it's very highly supported by garment workers and labor led. Workers United out the gate supported it, AFL-CIO. And again, it gets to this question of how can it be for the remaining 100,000 garment workers left here in the United States that they're toiling in poverty when this industry is so profitable? And so it sets the floor to be the minimum wage rather than piece rate. But what I love about this bill and why we at this point have 180 supporters, many coming from industry, is that it also has incentives for what it means to be building a more sustainable, ethical industry right here at home. There's a $40 million grant program for factories to tap into, for upgrading machinery, for job skill development, and there's also a tax credit. And I think that's really important, right? Because you cannot have regulation that doesn't have the incentives built in it. And frankly, American manufacturing hasn't had that kind of government support in a really long time. So the bill is now picking up steam. It's been wonderful to see, different states start to show leadership and be run by the labor as well as industry coming together to push for it. Of course, now the midterms are upon us. So, we'll see what happens with the midterms, but then keep pushing for the Fabric Act to become the law here in the United States.
Yeah, it was really exciting to see when that first was announced that it was at Ferrara Manufacturing. I actually worked with them when I worked at Ralph Lauren decades ago. But yeah, that was really cool to see from a personal perspective. And of course, that she's our state senator here in New York as well. You brought up the midterms, and I wonder, like, what it's so exciting to introduce these things, and it's amazing that SB 62 got passed in California. I wonder if you can just speak a little bit about the status of some of these things, and how also, even if it just passes in California, or I want to talk to you about the New York's Fashion Sustainability and Transparency Act as well. If it's introduced here or passed in certain parts of the world, whether it's the EU or here in the United States, how that actually affects and changes the whole industry, because if we're selling here or producing here, it affects in different parts of the world as well. Can you speak to that, where we are in terms of maybe how the Fabric Act may or may not get passed, and then how they also help impact the rest of the world as well?
Yeah, well, speaking of the midterms, for those listening in who are American citizens, I can't stress enough how important it is to vote in the midterms. Very often, most, especially young people, will only vote perhaps for the presidential election, but no more. But, midterms is where a lot of policymakers, you decide whether, the people who you value, who would value this type of bill, are going to keep their House seats and their Senate seats. And so important to just really be a part of our democracy. Now, look, a lot of this, when it comes to legislation, these are long fights. It's not a sprint. Like to say, it's very much more a test of endurance, like a marathon. And so, whether or not whatever happens with the Fabric Act, the idea that at a federal level we have socialized the importance of joint liability, holding companies accountable for the prices that they pay, that has ricochet effects, not just here, but all over the world, because, fashion is very much a global industry. Customers are all over the world. It's produced all over the world. And what we're needing is really for policymakers in different parts where the brands are headquartered, but also where the brands are manufacturing, to start to see some through lines in how do we pass legislation that gets to the root causes of some of these issues, right? One of the things we've learned is that, much like the private auditing industry, just getting a regulation passed that looks at reporting for the sake of reporting or data collection simply doesn't get us very far. What we need is remediation. What we need is a way to get money back in the hands of garment workers themselves. That's the best way to address the human rights abuses. That's the best way to deal with climate impacts as well, right? If you pay a living wage, you can't make that cheap, ultra fast fashion, rock bottom product. And that's the fastest way to then get to the overconsumption problem. So really, when we look at the Fabric Act or the Garment Worker Protection Act in California, my hope is that it inspires policymakers all over the world to look at this bill and realize that this is really the future, where we have to center worker demands, and it really is about wages at the end of the day.
You're right. And making the business case, back to what you said earlier, making the business case for sustainability as well, and for workers' rights along the way. Do you know any update on the New York's Fashion Sustainability and Transparency Act? I was just wondering if you knew anything about where that was. I know we're also back to the midterms, but it's up to the politicians and things as well. But I was wondering if you knew any.
Well, I can just speak to our role, and in terms of our role, it always is, as I said, going back to what unions and workers want. And so we've been very lockstep in, connecting with Workers United and other organized labor to have a look at the bill, and propose some amendments, which again center what workers want, which is to say, how do we assure that, in the state of New York, much as we've done in California, workers are made whole, they're making a minimum wage, and that the best way to tackle this is through that joint liability. So I believe the bill is still in amendments. Obviously, now with everything in recess, we'll see what happens. But for us, it always goes back to whose voices is this regulation centering, really uplifting the demands of our worker communities and union colleagues, and standing in solidarity with them.
Yes, it's what I do appreciate that about the New York Fashion Sustainability and Transparency Act is it does hold brands accountable, right? If they and it does affect anyone selling here that's making a certain amount of money will be taxed. I think 2% of their net sales if they're not complying with the that law. We'll see if that gets passed as well. I appreciate also what you're saying about unionization because we're also hearing about that so much, whether it's Starbucks or Trader Joe's or
Amazon warehouses.
Yeah, actually, just this week, I don't know if you heard, there was a fire in the Amazon that was that voted to unionize, and 45 workers were turned away because they didn't go back to work after the fire. So it's so interesting and really disheartening to hear those things still happening today right here in our own backyard. Do you know about any of the European Union legislation in terms of what's been introduced there and how that will affect us here in the United States?
So, unions, of course, are a very important, essential backbone of how we've won most labor protections. And I think it's interesting for students to know that, especially in the fashion industry, this was a lot of women led power. You go back and study the history of organizing in the industry, and it really was, we used to have a very thriving union movement when we made a lot of clothes right here at home. And so I think it's really exciting to see some of the solidarity we've seen with northern based unions and global south unions. Of course, with most of our production overseas now, it's really important to be in allyship and lift those voices. I often wish in sustainability conversations and conferences, where's the workers? Where's the union leaders? How can we uplift her voice? Because we are just allies. She knows best. And so, seeing some of this is very exciting, but to put it in context, it's also very dangerous. A lot of countries where fashion is made today, there is a lot of union busting. It's very dangerous. We met with very young garment workers in Myanmar before the junta, took over those factories. And often I sometimes think of the places where fashion is produced as, we have no business being in countries where the human rights abuses are so immense. But going back to your question of, okay, we have some interesting movement, in California and New York federally, what's happening in Europe? In Europe, we're seeing some interesting human rights due diligence laws, particularly in France and Germany. And I think there is this awakening and understanding of, how do we get companies to be looking at and reporting on their human rights in a more streamlined manner rather than just saying what they say? Because what you see with sustainability reporting on a voluntary basis is they keep moving the goalpost. I can't tell you how many companies will say, we'll pay a living wage by X date. And then the date comes and goes. It's like, oops, just kidding. Now we'll pay it, 10 years from now. And the same thing with climate targets, right? So I think it's a wait and see. It's very early days for some of these human rights due diligence laws to be taking into effect. But overall, I'm just very hopeful that you do have more and more governments that are realizing that they have a responsibility here.
Yes, it's really, it does feel, I appreciate you saying hope because, and your words about some of the countries that we're in are really, powerful for students to hear and for us. And, even working in the industry for years, you don't really see very often the people whose lives you're affecting all the time. And so it's powerful to think about. What do you think are any next steps for legislation in the fashion industry?
Yeah, I think the climate conversation needs more teeth. Going back to what I said around overproduction, you've got a lot of tinkering on the edges right now. We're not going to recycle plastic our way out of this mess, or cutesy capsule collections. I mean, the heart of the problem is we're just making too much, and we're throwing it away too fast. And what does regulation look like in that parameter? Because certainly the markets are going to keep rewarding this pro growth model. And so that's a question mark in my mind. And we've been talking a lot about human rights and living wages. One of the things that I often think about is, well, what does responsible transitions look like? in this industry as well. We know that automation, big tech, AI is here, it's here to stay. And yet we have millions of women, for the most part, who've been the backbone of this industry, making poverty wages. And so as the industry starts to consolidate or move more to being a technologically forward industry, what is this industry's responsibility to that workforce? And it really sharpened that focus for me over the last couple of months, because my home country of Pakistan's been underwater, as sort of front lines of the climate crisis. And Pakistan is very important from a cotton production standpoint, but also a lot of big American brands produce there. And yet, during that crisis, I think other than H&M making a $250,000 grant, we didn't see any financial support from the industry. And I think that's sort of a proof point around, the very same people who are on the front lines of the human rights crisis are also the same people who will continue to be on the front lines of the climate crisis. And what's the industry going to do to make her whole?
Wow, yeah, that is so much to think about. And I think that you're really touching on some really powerful things to help students think about what we can do as being change agents in this industry going forward, and realizing how we can make a difference personally, and just calling out brands, like you say, getting in touch with with our legislators, and making our voice heard. Thank you so much for your time, Ayesha. That was so interesting, and we really appreciate it.
I just leave students with just one thing: to be kind to themselves. I know that in COVID it's been very difficult. Online Zoom school, worrying about whether you'll have a job coming out of graduation, mental health concerns. And so here at ReMake, we really do try and do this work from a place of hope and joy and inspiration. So much of this is about finding your community, so you're not feeling isolated and doing this alone, which is why we have our ambassador community, some 1,500, I'd say, front lines of loving fashion, but wanting it to do better. And so for any students who are interested in becoming a ReMake ambassador, we connect you by your interest area, by your zip code, so that you can have swap parties and really be in community and not feel as though you have to take all these wicked problems on by yourself.
That's so wonderful. Thank you for that. So if students are interested, they should go onto the ReMake website. And like you said, they can drill down to their zip code and find like-minded souls to connect with.
Yeah, they can go to remake.world to fill out an ambassador application. It takes not even 2 minutes of your time. And then once accepted, we can do that for them.
Oh, that sounds great. Thank you so much for that. And thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, Ayesha. Great to see you. Hope to see you on campus again soon.
I would love that. Thank you, Anne.